Welcome to another DirectionsMag podcast, co-hosted with our friends at URISA.
Hi, my name is Rachel and I am a second-year PhD student at Arizona State University. I'm also a former Vanguard cabinet member of URISA and a current URISA member. The URISA Directions Magazine podcast series this year will explore the theme of New and Now. How did geospatial technology start? Where is it now? And what are some current focus areas or points of interest? Today, I'll be facilitating a podcast focused on geofencing warrants. So geofencing is a geospatial technology that alerts people to know when a device enters, leaves, or lingers in an area. And it's a concept that has been around the industry for more than 30 years. Like many aspects of geospatial technology, interest and applications for geofencing are discovered and picked up by a variety of groups to address information, organizational workflows, and improve processes. Today, we welcome a return guest, Chris Dunn, to discuss the new and now of geofencing warrants. Chris, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your interest in geospatial technology?
Sure. When I got back from the Gulf War, I needed a job. And so I went to college, and back at K-State, GIS was hot and happening, and they had a great program, and I just thought, well, this is the thing for me. And so throughout my career, I've had a variety of different administrative, executive level jobs, but I always kept GIS on my desktop, and I've always found it extremely useful. And then in 2011, I just decided I'd like to go somewhere different. So I went to law school. And the entire time I'm in law school, I'm focused on geospatial issues in the law, and there wasn't a lot of information there, and everybody thought I was kind of a crackpot for trying to really dig deep into that topic. But I've over the years, since I graduated and passed the bar, I've really focused on geospatial issues. I run a small business that's a geospatial consulting firm. Basically, we make 3D demonstrative exhibits for other attorneys to use in the court of law, or property boundary dispute maps in conjunction with surveyors and that sort of thing. And this topic of geospatial warrants came across my radar about a year ago, and the question that occurred to me is not whether they're constitutional or not. That'll get sorted out by powers much greater than I. But what should be the best practices, and what kind of issues, ethical issues, might a geospatial person run into if they're asked to process one of these geofence warrants? So that's my intro.
Thank you, Chris. Can you tell us a little bit more about the historical uses of location tracking and geofencing in geospatial technology, and sort of where these warrants are coming from?
Well, sure. Now, geofencing, like you said, has been a concept that's been around for a long time, and we've seen it really blossom in, UAVs and that sort of thing. But the geofence warrant, from what I can tell, is a relatively new thing. And let me give you some numbers. I'm going to look these up. They've been going. All right, in 2018, Google says it received 982 geofence warrants from law enforcement. In 2020, that number was 11,554. And so it's growing. I've also tracked, the mention of geofence warrants in Google search engines and that sort of thing. And this is mostly limited to states like California, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, where it's being used by law enforcement. And essentially a geofence warrant is this. Something illegal happened. Somebody robbed Bob's liquor store. Unfortunately, the clerk didn't survive. There's no good camera information, and law enforcement is sort of at a loss. This is the main scenario. So what they will do is they will create a polygon, and in that they'll describe that polygon in the time period they're searching for in their warrant. they'll take that to a judge who, is supposed to be skeptical and may issue the geofence warrant. And then the geofence warrant is typically just sent to Google because a lot of the other folks don't participate willingly in this. Google and AT&T tend to, be more accommodating to law enforcement. And as we all know, our phones are tracking us 6, 7 different ways to Sunday. You've got the Wi-Fi, the cellular triangulation, and whether your GPS unit's on there or not. There's all sorts of ways the phone is providing its position. And so once the geofence warrant has been issued, they go to Google, and Google provides a sort of a snapshot of everyone or every phone that was in the box or the circle or whatever at that particular time period. And they also provide a sort of error factor in this table data dump that they give to law enforcement. And that information is processed by law enforcement, and then they will pick from it, and we don't know how they select from it, some phones that they want more information on. So that's the second stage of a geofence warrant. Well, they'll send a request back to Google or AT&T and say, okay, we've identified these. Please provide us with all of the information you have about that person, email address, name, whatever they have on file. Now, the interesting thing is when Google does this search, they have this large location database that goes way back in time. They're literally searching every single person that's had an Android phone and in the world. And so it's a really vast search that it's sort of called a reverse warrant, because you're not, under the Fourth Amendment, you have a right to be secure in your person and your papers from an unreasonable search, and that search has to be signed off by a judge. And so, the legal argument is this allowed under the Fourth Amendment? Is it allowed under the Fifth Amendment right to, stay silent and not testify against yourself? And the Sixth Amendment, which is, the right to confront the people that are giving testimony against you, and this testimony. So there's a lot of really interesting legal issues tied up in that. And so the police or some form of law enforcement has that database, and then they start working it to see if any of those, suspects are caught up in the illegal incident. So hopefully that makes some sense.
Yes, thank you, Chris. So it sounds like there's quite a few places or black boxes in this process where we don't quite understand how the data is handled or selected. You mentioned one being that law enforcement is selecting certain individuals from this list for further review, and you also mentioned that there's a little bit of uncertainty surrounding the data itself. How might this uncertainty surrounding the data be an issue or an ethical question for GIS analysts moving forward?
Okay, so most law enforcement agencies that are doing geofence warrants are contracting with a few of the companies that process this information, and that's its own black box. We don't really have insight into their algorithms, and we don't have insight into, if you just cut the corner of the box and you're only in there a second or two, are you eliminated or are you further investigated? Also the phones, there's all kinds of problematic issues with location data once you get into like a high reflectivity event where you got multipath error when you go inside a particular structure. And so it's sort of a black box, and we don't really know how these firms are processing it. And one of the things I'm trying to get ahead of this is by creating a set of best practices, because I have a feeling that someday, the local sheriff department's going to use the local GIS office and say, hey, could you please process this for me? And that GIS tech, it's potentially full of ethical landmines, and that GIS tech should have some reference to some articles on the ethics, and they should have access to some best practices. And so I'm trying to develop that with some other folks that are interested in this, and I'm going to work with some criminal defense attorneys, which are, normally everybody goes, boo, but, when the government can track you just about everywhere, I think there'll be a great ally. One of the other things we ought to talk about is Stingray, which is a mobile device that law enforcement has access to, where they essentially emulate a cell tower. Now, they typically target one person with that, and that's normally with a warrant, but they're pulling every bit of data that's coming to and from that phone, as well as other phones, but they're only supposedly copying the phone that they've got a warrant for. And so there's all kinds of things out there that are gobbling up your data. And the general, to summarize the law the way the Supreme Court has said, is, do you have an expectation of privacy in your own cell phone and in your transmission? And a long time ago, they said, you do for the actual message content, you don't for the fact that you own a cell phone and you're transmitting. And so the government isn't violating your rights if they're just collecting the metadata that's out there in the ether. So it's pretty complex, and like I said, other people will figure out whether these things stand up and are constitutional. And like most things in the law is always going to be far behind the technology. So who knows, when the right case will eventually be accepted by the Supreme Court. So.
I like what you said about the law always being behind the technology. That's a very interesting statement. And given the legal questions and the complexities that you mentioned, what are you thinking about including in these best practices, or what are some of the questions that you're currently pondering in developing these best practices for geofencing data management?
Okay, so the Google accuracy information, it's basically a spreadsheet they give you, second by second. Here's a phone ID number. Here's the Latin lawn, and then there's the accuracy column has a number in it. We don't know the algorithm that went into calculating that. That would be kind of nice to know, or maybe we can, reverse engineer that with some experiments. But my plan is to work with some other folks, write this stuff up, put it out on the internet, and then have it, just destroyed. Because, if you're going to really polish a policy, the first thing you do is put it on the internet and wait for people to tell you where you're wrong. And just see if we can come up with something that an ethical GIS person can say, yeah, this makes sense on how I should process this. I mean, it's not an anti-law enforcement thing. Absolutely not. There are times and places where I think this is an ethical use of the technology. But I've been in situations where law enforcement has leaned on me to get a result. And we should talk about how you resist that particular bit of pressure, and how you can, eventually the GIS tech is going to be called in to testify. if they were the ones that processed that information. And not, every small town law enforcement agency is going to be able to afford the black box service provider that auto handles your geofence warrants. So I have a feeling this is going to leak out into our field. I could be completely wrong, but I think it would be a service to the community if we could get ahead of it. So.
Thank you. So we've spoken a little bit about some of the data complexities and the developments between the legal aspects and the technology aspects of these geofencing warrants. Can you paint a broader picture of the legal landscape and sort of the issues that you see coming down the pipeline with these geofencing warrants?
Sure. I'm no great legal scholar. I paid attention to the things that seemed to be vaguely geospatial when I was in law school, and I try to keep up with my reading. And I've got some Google alerts set up, so if a certain key phrase comes in, and I've tried to, the media often writes very superficial articles about geofence warrants. These are an invasion of privacy. They rarely talk about, the geospatial tech and practices involved in processing this stuff. And so forming the best practices is not something you can really do from the media and those reviews. And there's only been a couple really good articles on this particular topic. And there's a Harvard Law Review article out there. It's fairly recent. All you got to do is type Harvard Law Review geofence warrants, and it'll come up. But it's mostly a discussion of the legalities, the constitutionalities. So I'm hoping to spark a discussion on, the actual tech. And what do you do when you get the file download and you're asked to process it and help find suspects? Or, what do you do if they give you the file download and say, we've already got our suspect, can you confirm it? There's all kinds of situations, I think, where, when it comes to our geotech people, we ought to be prepared.
I guess following up on that, two of the big data providers that you mentioned were AT&T and Google. I know lots of people have Android phones, but then there's lots of people that have iPhones, for instance. Does this mean that there's a disparity in the types of data that are available or that are being used depending on people's phones?
And one of the interesting facts I came across in researching this was that income challenged people and people of color tend to go with Android a lot more than they go with Apple. And so when you write a geofence warrant, if you can't go to every database, you're essentially just selecting from a subset of people. And I don't own any Apple products. I have a hard enough time keeping one operating system in my head. But I do have to admire how Apple has resisted just sort of the strong arming by law enforcement. They've had, law enforcement come at them numerous times to decrypt phones and other things. So that policy is, I think, to be admired. But at the same time, it treats equally situated people differently under the law. And that's, I think, will be probably the Achilles heel of geofence warrants when they go to the Supreme Court. The other hand, Congress could pass a law tomorrow saying, you will cooperate with geofence warrants, and they're not, other than, resist the law with a lawsuit, they're not going to have much choice. And that may be coming down the road. And, law enforcement may lobby for that rather than lose the ability to, issue a geofence warrant. And a lot of people talk about how facial recognition software was the big thing that targeted people that were in the January 6th events. And from what I'm reading, it was geofence warrants. And so, thousands of people have been identified because, you go into the box, your phone is transmitting your location. And if I'm a defense attorney, I'm going to want to look at everybody, and I want to see, well, were any of these folks with phones actually government agents in the box, and what was their participation in this particular set of events? And, that's thinking like a defense attorney, regardless of the politics involved in it. Who else was in the fray? And are you going to be able to get that data and, do your own reverse search? And will, these folks cooperate and give you that information, or will the government stab it? And a lot of people that are identified by geofence warrants will never know that's how they were identified, because if law enforcement can come up with another reason for targeting that person, they don't necessarily have to disclose in the discovery period that technology. I know they go to great lengths to keep the Stingray technology under wraps, and oftentimes will even drop a case if the judge requires the disclosure of some Stingray information, depending upon, obviously the severity of the case. So, and the other problem is most judges and people that are entering, who are approving geofence warrants or who are handling challenges to them are not techies. Typically, the most technical courts in the nation are out in California and New York. And so it's most likely to get, we'll get a case out of those two, I'm sure, because judges are better able to understand the complexities.
So my understanding then is that these geofencing warrants and the information, the spatial information that is coming from them can be used in the courts without the disclosure that that's where the information itself is coming from. Is that correct?
Could you say that again?
Mm-hmm. So based on the example that you just gave, it could be that a geofencing warrant is used and that information is applied in court without without the knowledge that that is kind of the incriminating evidence, I guess, if you will.
Well, all right. If I was wanting to prosecute, let's say somebody that we believe robbed, the liquor store, I would use something like, when you've got any one of the Esri products where they show time, so you could show that person's dot moving and, in a geospatial context, and you could show, okay, they were in there long enough to, commit the crime, and then they fled. And so you can show them coming in the box and out of the box. And then I think once you've got that, you can go back and get more information, say, show me this phone's tracking information for the Idaho killer. They got his geospatial information off of that guy's phone for apparently months back, and were able to show how he was maneuvering and shadowing the potential or the victims, and they also had their phones. And, if you show those two dots exhibiting patterns that are consistent with the crime, that's pretty compelling, evidence. So it could end up in court like that as well.
Wow. And it sounds like, as you mentioned before, that there's only some of the data might be available to the analysts who are asked to look into these warrants. They might
Right.
have half of the cell phone data or part of the cell phone data and not the entire picture because of the availability and access to the data that law enforcement has.
Right. And most GIS texts don't handle data sets that are restricted or that are, considered confidential by the local government. And, there are, and this kind of gets into open records. Every state's got its open records law, and there's always an enumerated list of things that the state is not required to share. It's not forbidden to share, but it's not required to share. And I have a feeling a lot of this will either fall under an existing law enforcement exclusion from sharing, or perhaps will be adopted in state legislatures to say, geofence warrants are confidential, or the geofence warrant data dumps are confidential and can't be shared.
You've done such a good job answering my questions, Chris.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
I've been thinking about this for a while, but until we get a lot of conversation going, I don't know where I'm wrong. I don't know what I'm missing. And I'm kind of excited. It's starting to get interest. I just recently presented about an hour on this topic up at the Wisconsin Land Information Association's annual conference, and that was, that's their GIS people and their registrars. And by the way, great conference if you ever get a chance to go visit with those folks. They're amazing.
Moving forward, thinking about geofencing warrants, say 10 or 15 years from now, what do you think will be the big questions and the big issues that both the legal field and then the geospatial field will be wrestling with?
Well, I think it's going to take somebody with very deep pockets or an association, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I don't know if you remember them, but they were sort of the early ACLU for computer data privacy. And they're located out in San Francisco, California, but their website has really good information about geofence warrants. You got to dig a little bit, but they're doing some good work. Reason Magazine, which is a libertarian organization, they're doing some work on geofence warrants. So the discussion has begun, but there hasn't been an association that's kind of come around on this, or a treaty or allies. I'm not finding the right words. We haven't had our little conference yet where we all start talking about the various ways of addressing this. And so over the next, I imagine, few years, there will emerge sort of a coalition of folks that are concerned about it. And then eventually the right plaintiff will come along, and they'll be innocent, and yet their life will be ruined because they were caught up in a geofence warrant. And then you have to lose at the local court, you have to lose at the Court of Appeals, and then you have to petition certiorari at the Supreme Court, and then they've got to take your case, and then it's got to be just, the right set of facts challenging the constitutionality. And that may take a decade or so to emerge. And I don't know. Supreme Court, there are people far more knowledgeable about how they deal with things. But from what I can tell is sometimes they ignore the law and just do what they think is best for the country, which isn't always something I think is best for the country. So who knows where it's going to go? I hope to see it eventually dealt with one way or the other at the Supreme Court. But 10 to 15 years is probably the right time frame.
It definitely sounds like we're at the beginning of a discussion rather than at the end of one.
I think so.
So, Chris, are there any other things that we should know about geofencing warrants?
My only suggestion would be for people to be aware of the information that's coming off of their phones and be a little skeptical about the end user license agreements that you click on as you authorize various apps, and look into that. See exactly what's being reported to these large databases. Like most, the old law enforcement saying is, if you're not doing anything wrong, you don't have anything to worry about. Well, that's nice, but it's not always the case. Sometimes, your phone testifying against you is something you should be concerned about.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. And I wanted to also say thank you to Directions Magazine for having us.